Hey, what's up everyone? So today we're going to continue with our Piotroski Score tutorial calculation. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you the data source that we're getting everything from. So we're using a data source called IEX Cloud, and this is an API that will allow us to pull all of our data. So you can just create an account here. It's about, for an individual account, it's about $7 a month, and you can get access to a ton of securities data. So we got balance sheet data, cash flow, dividends, earnings for our stocks. We can pull historical prices, intraday prices. We can even pull some qualitative data such as news items, earnings, IPO calendar, streaming news, historical news. There's even some Forex information here and end of day option data, social sentiment data. So a lot of data in this API. So if you just go to iexcloud.io, you can create an account and pull this data. So let's get started. So what I've done here is we're going to need a few libraries. So we're going to have to import requests, we're going to have to import pandas as PD, and then we're also going to need from pandas JSON normalize. This will help us view our output data. So, and then I've specified my token here. So you're going to need a token that you can get from IEX Cloud. I'm going to set a variable API to cloud, because you could also set it to sandbox, which will allow you to do for a testing environment, so you won't get charged, and for every API request. And then there's also, we're going to look at ticker for today. The period we're going to look at is annual, and then we're going to look at the last 4 annual periods. So you'll notice we can look at our balance sheet here. So we're going to pull our balance sheet data, and so let me show you what that looks like. So here you can see that the API documentation is great. It's very easy to read. So you can see we can get our HTTP request, the JSON response here. We can look. This is the data weighting. This has to do with the price per API call. And we have some examples here. So it's great. We can just pull these examples, and you can see exactly what the output is. And so this is exactly what we're going to code up and pull. So that's what I'm doing here. So this request is, I'm specifying the API, which is cloud. The ticker is going to be Apple, just these zeros, the period 4, annual, the last is going to be 4, and then I'll put in my token. So we can just pull that out. So let's run this. So import request, put my token in, cloud, ticker, we're going to look at it as Apple, annual. There we go, we have responsive status 200. That's essentially just this request right here. That's exactly what I did for the balance sheet. So let's move forward. So you can see what the output is. So that's what I've done here. And so what I've done here is I got a JSON request, right? I'm getting JSON and put into a dictionary, but I want to normalize it so that I can put it into a data frame. So what basic JSON that normalize is doing, I'm taking this JSON dictionary and I'm looking at the record path of balance sheet, because there's different record paths in there, and I want to look at specifically at the balance sheet record path. So to explain what I'm talking about, we can take out this JSON dictionary, and you can see what I'm talking about here. So JSON dict. So there you go. And so there's these different record paths. So if I took symbol, I would get Apple, but I want to look at the balance sheet record path because that's a dictionary in itself. And I just want to look at all that data. And so that's what I've done here. So when I'm using JSON normalize, I take in the JSON dictionary and I specify I just want to look at the balance sheet record path. And then I put that into a data frame. So you can see this is the data frame like so. So how it's organized is we have the most recent annual period all the way to the last 4. So, and we have that, and then we have our data in our columns here. So that will be important later when I'm pulling data. So for example, if I want to look at current cash, I would have to use something. I would take balance. What I can do is I can take our data frame balance and I can use a function called .iloc, which is just an index. I'm locating the index that I'm interested in. So let's say I'm interested in the 0th index. And so that would give me the first row, right? So I got the first row. But maybe I only want to look at current cash. So again, I can put brackets and I can say current cash. There we go, and I can get that variable quite easily. So let's do that again. So maybe I want to look at the second, or in this case, this would be the third annual balance sheet statement going back 3 years. So but that would be an element of 2. So I can see that. So I got that row, and I want to look at short-term investments. So I could take the column short-term investments, and there you go. So there we go. So it's quite easy to pull the data. So I'm going to do the same thing for income statement. So we'll pull income statement, put it into a data frame here. So called income. We're going to look at balance sheets as well, and I put into a data frame called cash flow. Excuse me. We're going to look at cash flow statements, and we're going to pull that, and we're going to put it into a data frame called cash flow. And then we can see all the columns that we're interested in. So we have cash flow.columns. We're probably going to need operating cash flows, which in IX defines that as cash flow here. You can see there's a lot of other variables here that are important. Capital expenditures, if you wanted to calculate free cash flow. We can look at balance.columns and then income.columns. So again, in the balance.columns, we're going to need obviously the net income line. And we're going to, income, we're going to need a net income line. In the balance, we'll probably need total assets to calculate return on assets, etc. So let's do this. So let's take a look at income again. Again, what I was stating before, if we want to look at total revenue and we want to see not this year, most recent year, but the year before, we can say specify element of 1. There we go. There we go. So let's run right through this. Balance. I'm just specifying all the data so you can see all the data that is available in here. Now I'll have this all available in my GitHub so you can just run this Python notebook. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create our F-score. So if you remember in the Piotroski score, it can be anywhere from an F-score value of 0 to an F-score value of 9, given any of these variables if they're positive or if they're positive or negative. So what we're going to do is first we're going to look at profitability. So we'll specify our F-score 0. And now we want to look at return on assets. So remember, return on assets is we just take our income divided by the beginning of the year total assets in this case. And so again, we can look at the income statement. Remember, it's the beginning of the year. It's the most recent year income statement. And we want to look at the beginning of the year total assets. So we have to look at element of 1, not element of 0. And we'll notice it is positive. So what I've done here is I've done an if-else statement. So I take the income. If the return on assets is greater than 0, then I add that plus equals to 1 to our original variable F-score. And if else, I don't add anything, plus equals 0. So if we run that, you'll notice that is positive. So we added 1 to our F-score variable, initialized variable. Now we look at, for the next element, the next variable that Piotroski looks at is operating cash flow. If that is positive, that will be added to the F-score. If it's not, that would be a value of 0, not added. So we'll run that, and it is positive. Again, we'd use an if-else statement, so now our F-score is 2. Now, the third part of the profitability segment is he looks at change in return on assets. So what he's looking at is he's looking at the return on assets, most recent return on assets versus last year's return on assets, and it has that increased or not. So what we can do is we can take the most recent one, which we calculated before, and we want to look at the last one, which we calculated. So I don't need these brackets actually. So you'll notice that it's decreased. It started at 15.8% return on assets, and it's fallen down to 15.1. So if we calculated this, so what I've done here is I've done an if-else statement to say if the most recent return on assets is greater than the last year's return on assets, then we add that to the F-score, else we do not. So we should still have an F-score of 2. We do not add that, and we do. Okay? And again, this is Apple, right? Accruals. So the next thing that he looks at is accruals. And remember, the idea behind that was if the company had operating cash flows that were greater than income, that would be a sign of a stronger balance sheet, of a stronger company in that sense. And there was less room for manipulation of the income statement. So we can say accruals that we're just taking the cash flow, operating cash flow, and we're taking that from our cash flow statement data frame. And remember, we're looking at the most recent data, and we're just dividing it that by last year's total assets. So what he's doing is he's taking cash flow divided by total assets, so the return on cash flow, and then it's also looking at the return on assets. And what we've done here is if that is greater, if the cash flow return on assets is greater than the net income return on assets, then that will be added to the F-score. And in this case it is, so that's a good thing. So should have an F-score of 3 now, and we do. Now let's move on to the second segment. So Piotroski looks at leverage, and he looks at liquidity and sources of funds. So if you remember, we're looking at leverage. So for these companies, we want to see if they had needed to use less leverage. So a company, and remember these are weaker companies. These are high book value to price companies, to market companies. Therefore, if they had to increase leverage, that may be a sign that that's signaling to the market that they're weaker. So again, we can run through this, and what we're doing here is we're just taking long-term debt divided by total assets for the beginning of the year versus last year's. And if that is greater, that will, if that's less, if the beginning of the year is less than last year's leverage, then we would add to the F-score. Otherwise, if it's larger, if they had to raise more debt, essentially, that we would not add to the F-score. So again, we should have a value of 3, and we do. It has not changed. Let's continue. Now we're looking at change in current ratio. So change in current ratio, remember that's just, we're looking at our current assets. This is our working capital, essentially. So our current assets divided by our total current liabilities. And we're looking at from the most recent year versus last year. And if that's increased, that would be a positive. If it's decreased, that would be a negative, and we wouldn't add to the F-score. So we'll run through that. So it looks like it has increased, so that's a good thing. So we should, instead of an F-score of 3, we should be adding 1 to this. So it should be F-score of 4, and it is. And then finally, looking at change in number of shares. So what I've had to do here is I had to pull, this wasn't available in the APIs for balance sheet, cash flow, and income statement. So I had to pull a different API call, and that was from, if we go to back to the documentation, I had to pull data from stats. So if you look here, they have in the key stats call, API call, there is a variable called shares outstanding. And so I'm going to need that. So what we're doing here, basically Piotroski believe that, okay, just like in the situation with debt, if a weak company or a company that's been sold off had to raise debt, that was signaling to the market that was a negative signal to the market because it showed that they needed more money and they were weaker. The same idea with equity. And so if what we're going to look here is if a company had to issue any more shares, if the shares were greater than last year's shares, that would be a negative. That would be a signal to the market that's the negative, that they need to raise more equity. And obviously the stock would be diluted. So what we're doing here is, again, we're going to be pulling change in number of shares. So I'm looking at the most recent shares, and then you can see that here. And then I can actually pull another API call here, and I'm getting something from the time series API. And that's again, that's in here as well. So if I find shares outstanding, here we go. So I've had to use a different API call here, and this will allow me to get past shares outstanding. So if you guys can think of a different way to pull this in this API, maybe I'm missing something, but this is the way that I figured it out. But we can go into the past and get shares outstanding in the past and shares issued in the past. So there we go. So I'm going back. There we go. There we go. So now you notice that the shares issued in the past where we had about, what is that? About 44 million versus 43 million now. So what we're doing is, and essentially, so that's a good thing. So shares, if the current shares issued is less than last year's, then that we would add a 1 to the F-score. If else, we would not add anything. So we should increase our F-score now from, I believe it was a 4 to 5. And we do. So that's good. So basically, they reduced their issue share. They probably did some buybacks, but also they didn't need to raise or issue any more shares. All right, now finally we're looking at operating efficiency. And so in here, what we're doing here for what Piotroski want to look at is you want to look at gross margins. And so what we're doing to calculate gross margins, what we can take is we can take our gross profit. And remember, gross profit, that's just your net revenues, your total revenues, minus your cost of goods sold. And then finally that will be your gross profit. And so to calculate gross margin, you just take your gross profit divided by your revenues. So that would be a percentage. So now, and that's essentially what we're doing here. So we're taking a gross profit for the year divided by the total revenue for the year, most recent year. So we can calculate that. And that's 37% for Apple. It's nice, large one. So, and now we want to compare that from last year's. So was that larger or smaller? And it was a little bit smaller. So we would not add, so when we're doing this, we were looking for an increase of that, of gross margin. So we would not add to the F-score. So it should still stay at 5. Now finally we're looking at change in asset turnover. And that's just your total revenues divided by assets. And it's just showing, or another term is total sales divided by assets. We just want to see an increase in that. And so it just shows more how efficient a company is in utilizing their assets. The higher that value, the better. So again, what we're doing is just taking from our income statement, we're taking our total revenues line, and we're looking for the beginning of the year total assets. Remember that? So we have to take the first element, not the 0th element, because we want last year's, or the beginning of the year. So we'll run that, and so we notice the asset turnover is 0.71. Let's look at last year's, 0.70. So that's good, it's increased, so it's gotten more, that's a sign of efficiency. So we should be adding, so our total F-score should now be 6, and it is. So that is our Piotroski F-score of 6. So that's the calculation we have. And remember, at the end, Piotroski realized that a value closer, Piotroski F-score could be a value from 0 or 9. Anything closer to 9 is a sign of a stronger company that could outperform in the future. But remember, these were companies that were overly sold. This doesn't really bode well for growth companies or maybe larger cap companies. He found that this analysis works better with smaller, medium-sized companies that were overly sold, that had high book-to-market values or equivalently low book-to-price values. All right, guys, well, if you like this video, please subscribe. In my next videos, I'm going to actually try to develop a value score and a quality score, basically a screener, so that we can screen companies on based on a relative value if they're undervalued to the market, and also on relative quality if they have better quality compared to the market. So till next time, guys, thank you.